What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
So Action Comics is the best thing coming out of DC Rebirth right now, but it stands as one of the two preludes to Superman Reborn alongside Superman Multiplicity. Of course, Superman Multiplicity kind of being a really big one that focused exclusively on Superman and the Multiversal Justice League. Action Comics focuses on Clark Kent and Lois Lane and Lana Lang and a couple other characters here and there. But I think that Dan Jurgens basically just told us who Clark Kent is. So the cool thing about this is that this initially picks up with both Clark Kent and Superman, and we're going to reference them as Clark Kent and Superman so we can distinguish the difference. Clark Kent being the guy we don't know anything about, Superman, of course, being Superman. But of course, they're both kind of responding to situations in and of themselves. But the cool thing is that Clark Kent's responding to a totally separate situation involving Lois Lane, and Superman, of course, is responding to a situation involving Lana Lang. And that's going to be kind of one of the crazy situations, is because the alarm goes off in his little Fortress of Solitude out in the Himalayas. Because keep in mind, when the pre-New 52 Superman first showed up in the New 52, he basically operated out of the Himalayas. He didn't really have his own Fortress of Solitude because a New 52 Superman already had his own Fortress of Solitude. And so what ended up happening here is that pre-New 52 Superman used the Himalayas as kind of his base of operations, but when the New 52 Superman died, pre-New 52 Superman used Fortress of Solitude as kind of like his, kind of a place he can go to and get tools if he needs, but he still kind of leaves it as like a monument to the New 52 Superman. But in this instance, he's gonna have to go to the Fortress just because of the fact that the reason why the alarm went off is because Steel, John Henry Irons, has arrived here with Lana Lang. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, and this is something that I want to point out here, for those of you guys who don't know, Steel is a holdover from the reign of the Superman. I mean, when Superman died in 1992, 1993, whenever it was, DC came back and launched a story called Reign of the Superman. That gave us Cyborg, Hank Henshaw, that gave us the Eradicator, it gave us Superboy, and then it gave us Steel, John Henry Irons. And John Henry Irons was the only one of those four new Supermen that didn't have any powers. Instead, he was basically just like a metallurgist. He was a steel worker and fashioned himself a steel Superman suit, gave himself the name, and then walked around with like this giant hammer beating the hell out of people. It was pretty cool to see. But he was really, really popular. Like all the other characters who were Cyborg, Superman, Eradicator was kind of popular. Superboy was wildly popular. People loved Superboy, Metropolis Kid, whatever you want to call him. They loved those versions, so a lot of them just kind of were held over going into the New 52. Some were rebooted, some were not. But the idea is that Steel works very closely with Superwoman Lana Lang. And that's kind of like the +1 roster of Superman, so to speak, in the sense that when Superwoman first showed up in DC Rebirth, it was Lana Lang, it was Lois Lane, and then like you had Steel who would show up occasionally, and you had Lex Luthor. The cool thing is it was just kind of like this other group of heroes that had the powers of Superman, just to test the waters and see how people receive the story. It's really, really good. Like it's one of the most enjoyable stories, probably the best thing coming out of DC Rebirth. But the cool thing about this is that it basically shows us that Lana Lang is befalling the same fate as Lois Lane, because Lois Lane was essentially destroyed by her own powers. Her body broke down on the cellular level, but she was also killed before that happened anyway. And so the idea is that Lana Lang is succumbing to the same fate. Lana Lang's body is breaking down on the cellular level, and no one knows why. The only person that would really have any information about this, or even any inkling of what would happen, would be the actual Superman. And this is kind of the cool thing, is because the pre-New 52 Superman is the one you would want to go to anyway, because he has so much experience. He's died, he's come back to life, he's well-versed in Kryptonian technology. The New 52 Superman was still relatively inexperienced, and so it would have been like going to an intern instead of going to a doctor. And so they're going to the pre-New 52 Superman, not that they have a choice, but he's the best person to go to anyway, so it all works out. But at this point, we find out the reason why Clark Kent had basically taken off in the same fashion as Superman is because Lois Lane's going undercover. And she's basically going undercover in a local bar to bring down corruption involving a police officer, a councilman, and a mob boss. And the cool thing about this is really just sort of DC, sitting down. This is really just Dan Jurgens saying, hey guys, this is the Lois Lane you always remembered. And that was kind of necessary, because remember, when the New 52 Lois Lane died and the pre-New 52 Lois Lane took her place, the question was, how do the two relate to one another? Is DC going to keep the trend of the pre-New 52 Lois Lane being this sort of go get 'em, do whatever it takes to get the story character, or are they going to tone her back? And what Dan Jurgens said is no. The pre-New 52 Lois Lane is the same Lois Lane you always remember. She does whatever it takes in order to make sure that crime is brought to justice using her abilities as a reporter, so long as it doesn't cost her life in the process. And even then, there have been several instances in her publication history when she put her life on the line. Superman in order to make sure that that crime was brought to justice. This is one of those instances. She's in a room with a mob boss, a councilman, and a dirty cop. The entire bar is filled with henchmen of the mob boss. I mean, if they found out who she was, they would kill her. And that's one of the things that's going on right here. You have Clark Kent who's sitting in on it just because of the fact that, remember, he's a reporter, and then you have Detective Maggie who's just kind of here to basically bust the case. But with Lois Lane, with Lois Lane being undercover, basically it's one of these circumstances where the mob boss and the councilman and the cop basically spill all their dirty secrets for the bug that's been planted. It's like, yeah, man, like I'm really glad I voted for the bill that you needed passed in the council, and it's the mob boss saying, hey, here's your money for the illegal things that you guys did for me. It's very Dan Jurgens. It's very 1990s comic book, where instead of just kind of having a real world conversation, it would be like if I sat down and I talked to you and I said, hey man, do you want to go at 10:30 to the mall where we can go to the grocery store, or we can go to the shoe store and we can buy those new Nike Shox that we really like, because the new Nike Shox are the best shoes to have. It's very structured. It's very regimented in terms of how they talk. So it comes off a little bit hokey. It comes off a little bit of, was that dialogue really necessary? But it still works for the purpose that it served, because remember, the main emphasis here is Lois Lane. Now, of course, she is discovered. She's picked up just because of the fact that she's kind of talking under her breath to Detective Maggie behind the scenes, when she's out in this van. And the result is that one of the guys picks up on the fact that she's talking to someone and comes to the belief that she's a cop, or she's some kind of a mole or something along those lines, somebody working for another mob boss trying to circumvent this guy. In addition to that, Clark Kent panics. And again, this is going to be one of the things that I want you to focus on here, because Clark Kent has basically developed an obsession with Lois Lane. And this is why I say Dan Jurgens basically begins dropping hints as to who Clark Kent is. With regards to him basically showing up here in the middle of all this, it coincides with, Detective Maggie coming in there, and then Clark Kent comes in, he just kind of slips. It's kind of perfect timing. He slips into a couple of guys that were going to shoot Lois Lane, but the day's basically saved. Everything kind of corrals down pretty darn fast, and things wrap up. But from this point, of course, if you guys notice, there's Big Billy Burger, your number one source for hamburgers, but she basically begins, Lois Lane begins following Clark Kent, and that was really the gist of it, right? I mean, ever since this Clark Kent first popped up, Lois Lane's been wanting to know who this guy is, because Dan Jurgens introduced this guy and gave us no explanation of any real measure. Instead, you had the New 52 Superman who was dead, and then suddenly there's Clark Kent, and no one knew where he came from, no one knew what he was about, no one knew his story. He was hooked up to a polygraph. He gave Superman some story about how, well, my parents died in a gas main accident, and I was raised by the Kents, and it was all true. I mean, it was the story as it was told by this Clark Kent was 100% true. But then small things start to happen. Dan Jurgens injects some small things in here that don't make sense. This diet that Clark Kent has, where he basically eats like a little kid. When Lois Lane follows him to the apartment that he lives in, she goes into the door, she gets to the doorman and says, Clark Kent just came through here, I have a message for him. The guy says, no one came through that door. There's not a soul that came through that door. Check the cameras. I didn't see anyone. The cameras didn't record anyone. Not only that, Lois Lane starts to think about it for a second and says, well, I guess that makes sense. I haven't seen him for weeks or months or something like that. Her memory is altered. Now, in the realm of Superman's mythos, Superman's landscape, there's only one person that has that kind of power. But moving on, we end up jumping into the Fortress of Solitude, right? We go back to the Fortress of Solitude with, or really just the fortress, not really the Fortress of Solitude, but the Himalayan fortress, we'll go ahead and call it that to keep things easy. We end up jumping into the Himalayan fortress, and it's really just this idea that Superman doesn't know what's going on. And that was the whole premise. With Lois Lane, with New 52 Lois Lane, when she was Superwoman and she was basically losing her power, she was dying, or not really losing her powers, but her body was breaking down. No one knew what was going on. No one could figure out what was happening. With Lana Lang, she's succumbing to the exact same thing, but no one knows what's going on. But the cool thing about this is Dan Jurgens kind of plays it fast and loose with Superman. He kind of toys with Superman as we look at him, because historically speaking, a lot of people who were against the idea of Superman sort of say, well, Superman he's so smart, he's always got a solution for everything. Like, he's always got the resources to do whatever it is that he needs to do. But it's also the same thing with Batman. Batman fans kind of ignore the idea when people say, well, Batman's always got a solution for everything. His infinite utility belt has, and it's just one of those things where people kind of ignore the downsides of the characters they know and love. But the idea here is that Dan Jurgens kind of toys with this notion of Superman, saying, yeah, why not? He's Superman. Like, why wouldn't he know solutions or have an idea of how to fix something? Like, why wouldn't he have the ability to tap into those things? So what he says is, in this New 52 reality, the New 52 Superman had his Fortress of Solitude. And this is one of the instances where, Superman basically says, hey, look, I go to that fortress whenever there's tools that I need, whenever I need help, something like that. He basically races off alongside Steel in order to go to this fortress and see if they can't find a way to basically sort out what's going on with Lana Lang. Now, while this is happening, the entire situation is being monitored by Hank Henshaw. Now, this goes back to Superman, Lois, and Clark when the pre-New 52 Superman first showed up in the New 52. We have not covered that story. I will probably cover it somewhere along the line. At this point, Dan Jurgens is kind of taking us through Superman Rebirth in a way that we don't really need to. But there will come the introduction of a villain, or really the return of a villain named Blank, that will kind of require us to know a little bit about Superman, Lois, and Clark. Granted, what we need to know is very small. We don't need to know the entirety of the story, but I will upload that video, or I will upload those, I think it's really 2 videos because it's like 8 issues long. I will upload that so you guys understand the character of Blank and where he's coming from. But with regards to this, we basically jump back to Steve Lombard. Now, I love Steve Lombard. I love this guy. He's not really the office prankster, but he's like the guy that nobody takes seriously, but he's my homeboy. But anyway, what they're basically saying here, or at least he's kind of parading around with the idea that the Daily Planet is back to basically busting governmental corruption, going back to being a reputable newspaper. And that was really kind of the big deal. When the New 52 Lois Lane dumped the identity of the New 52 Superman during Superman Truth, a lot of people looked at the Daily Planet and said, well, this is them just basically jumping the shark. Like, this is pretty much the end of the Daily Planet. They're a tabloid magazine now. They're not a reputable news source. And so because of this, Steve Lombard had kind of been on this quest to restore the greatness of the company, if only through moral channels, making people feel better. But I love his character. But again, it's just one of these funny things, because Lois Lane is still hunting around, still trying to figure out what's going on with Clark Kent. But when she gets into her office, he's standing there with like coffee and flowers. And it's kind of cool because Lois Lane sits down and says, what in the world is going on with this guy? Not only that, he basically says, look, will you have dinner with me? Will you go with me on a date? Now, this puts Lois Lane in a weird situation because remember, no one's supposed to know that she's the pre-New 52 Lois Lane. No one's supposed to know that the Superman running around right now is the pre-New 52 Superman. And no one is definitely supposed to know that they have a son named Jonathan Kent. And so she's trying to keep her personal life separate from the life that everybody knows. I mean, everyone here at the Daily Planet, they believe that she's the New 52 Lois Lane. They don't know that the New 52 Lois Lane was Superwoman and that she died. No one knows that. And Clark Kent being here asking her on a date puts her in a tough spot because she's married. And so if she says yes, then that may be kind of looked at with a skewed eye, and not even she would be able to kind of live with herself long term with the situation. But in the end, she also sits down and says, this is best for both Superman and myself, because we're trying to figure out who this Clark Kent is. And she says, look, this guy's asking me on a date. He's basically giving me an exclusive. And so while it's a little bit questionable, it's the least of the questionable things that Lois Lane's ever done in the history of her publication history. She's done some really questionable things before. But what we end up doing is we kind of pick up with the tail end of this when we jump with Hank Henshaw, where he says, we need to go to the Fortress of Solitude. Like, we need to go to the Himalayan mountains. We need to figure out what's going on with Superman. We need to figure out what it is that he has to hide. Now, this is Dan Jurgens basically setting the very early foundations for the return of Cyborg, for the return of Hank Henshaw being Cyborg Superman. And that's one of these circumstances, one of these things where all stories come around full circle. But remember, DC Rebirth isn't kind of rehashing some of these older characters because they've just run out of ideas. DC Rebirth is doing that because it's designed to blend the old with the new. It's the charter of DC Rebirth. It's the purpose of it. It's not like, well, we just don't know what to do anymore, so we're just going to do the same old thing that we've always done. It's bringing back familiar faces, bringing back popular faces, and much loved faces. And so again, racing back to the Fortress of Solitude of the New 52 Superman, the cool thing about this is that Superman's still trying to figure this out. He's still trying to understand what's going on with her because he's never seen cellular degeneration like this before. But the other half of this is that she derived her powers from the New 52 Superman when he died, but she doesn't have his exact powers. And that's the difference. If Lana Lang's Superwoman had the exact same power set as Superman, it would be easier to diagnose. If she was Kryptonian, it would be easier to diagnose. But she's a human that has some kind of variant of the powers of Superman. She's literally a hybrid. She is unique unto herself. And so it's almost like trying to solve one person who's infected with one particular illness that no one's been infected with before and that no one's ever seen before. Superman doesn't even know where to start. He's just like, I have no idea where to start here. But then suddenly it kind of dawns on it. And of course, we'll get to that solution here in a second. But then basically what happens is Lois Lane, of course, is spending time in the apartment of the New 52 Lois Lane. Remember, that's where she sort of operates out of when she's not back in Smallville with Superman. But she's basically met with the arrival of Clark Kent. This is kind of cool because he's actually laying it on really, really thick. And the reason why I say it's kind of cool is because it's kind of funny in the sense that he's the worst first date ever. Like he's making like every mistake ever with the first date. Instead of just saying like, hey, like let's just go get a light meal and let's just go hang out and talk somewhere. He's like, we're gonna get you a limousine and we're gonna take you to like the most expensive restaurant in town. And it's just like, you're doing it all wrong, man. Like you're making yourself look like an ass. Like she's on a date to get to know you, not because of the shit you have. So it's kind of a funny situation with Clark Kent. He's making every wrong mistake that you could possibly make. But in any event, what Dan Jurgens does is he kind of jumps back and forth between what's going on with Superman in the Fortress of Solitude and with Lois Lane. And it's kind of cool to see. But the solution Superman comes up with is to basically take Lana Lang and throw her in some Kryptonian battle armor. And the reason why is because the battle armor has healing properties. And so while it won't necessarily, or it may not necessarily cure her of whatever it is that's causing this cellular degeneration, what it'll do is it'll stabilize her and it'll buy time. It'll keep her body in a state of flux so that Superman can basically go through, do as much research as he can on, whatever this ailment may be, do research on her and try to figure out a way to keep Lana Lang alive. Because keep in mind, Lana Lang is kind of this hold for Superman from days gone by, right? I mean, this is not his Lana Lang. It's not his Lana Lang from the pre-New 52. But in the pre-New 52 universe, Superman and Lana Lang go way back. She was one of the first people to learn about his powers. She helped him to use his abilities. And so when he showed up in the New 52 and he found this New 52 Lana Lang, it was kind of touching back to the woman that he remembered when he was a kid, one of his closest friends. And so for Superman, it's not a matter of, well, I mean, as a Superwoman, I really hope she recovers, but if she doesn't, sorry about her luck. It's this, wow, I mean, she's Lana Lang. I got to keep her alive because she's the closest thing that I have to the Lana Lang that I once called my friend. And so the cool thing about this is that in the middle of all that, back at the Himalayas in the previous Fortress of Solitude of Superman, again, it's Dan Jurgens kind of setting the stage for Cyborg as well as the return of Blank. And what I mean here is with Hank Henshaw and with his various guys there, they send one of their men, Ramirez, into the Himalayas to figure out what's going on. And what happens here is when he accesses this fortress held by Superman, he encounters Blank. Now, in Superman, Lois, and Clark, the story that detailed the return of the pre-New, or really the appearance of the pre-New 52 Superman in the New 52, Blank was really like the main villain of the story. He just kind of showed up out of nowhere, and Dan Jurgens gave us no information. We don't know anything about Blank other than the fact that he has telepathy and telekinesis, and he can give Superman a run for his money, and that's it. That's the only thing we know. We don't know his backstory. We don't know where he comes from. We don't know if he's even human. We don't know anything about that. All we know is that he's just a really powerful guy. But by virtue of his telepathy, what he does is he seizes control of Ramirez, and then he uses his telepathy to basically obliterate the fortress. And so the result is that Blank is basically out and free on the world. Now, the reason why this is so significant is because Blank will just engage in chaos and destruction. That's all he's going to do. He's just going to go around and destroy things. And so again, it's this really crazy situation because it's one of the most powerful foes that Superman has ever faced. Now, switching back to Clark Kent and to Lois Lane, this is really entertaining. This is really funny. This was actually pretty hilarious. Lois Lane is baffled, right? She's just like, okay, this was supposed to be us sitting down, maybe at a Chinese joint, because Chinese sounds amazing right now. But she was like, it's us sitting down at a Chinese joint, getting some great noodles or some General Tso's chicken, because everybody loves General Tso's chicken. And I don't, if you don't like General Tso's chicken, there's something wrong. There's not something wrong with General Tso's chicken. There's something wrong with you. But, but she's like, look, it was just supposed to be a casual conversation. She's getting in too deep. And the reason why she starts getting in too deep is because Clark Kent's lost his mind. The whole reason why he's gone crazy is because he actually proposes to her. He says, hey, look, will you marry me? And at this point, she's just like, what the hell's going on? Well, of course, she just ends up bailing out. I mean, this is what we would expect, because the great thing about Lois Lane and Superman are the 1-2 punch of comic book couples. You know, Lois Lane is the first lady of comics. And maybe I'm getting a little too wrapped up in this. Maybe it's more that I'm kind of idolizing the characters, in terms of where they stand in the comic book mythos. But in my mind, no one comes close. It's Superman, Lois Lane, and then a distant second. And then you got third, fourth, fifth, so on and so forth. Now, how you arrange those from, second on, it's whatever you want to choose. But at the top, it's always been Superman and Lois Lane. And so for her as a character throughout every iteration, the reboots and the whole 9 yards, she's always been the right hand of Superman. She's always been with him through thick and thin, no matter what happens. Her loyalty is not to be questioned. And so when Clark Kent suddenly busts, this weird Clark Kent busts out of nowhere and says, will you marry me? She's like, nope, now we're out. Because she's like, for her, it's an unquestionable thing. Like that's an unconscionable thing. To even entertain the idea of seeing another man outside of her husband isn't possible. Not only that, getting married is just kind of crazy because this guy's weird and she doesn't know anything about who he is. And so, of course, she takes a taxi and ends up bailing out. But then Clark Kent follows them. He says, look, we were supposed to be together. You and I were supposed to be together. Someone took you from me. Now, on the surface, surface, it looks like Clark Kent's just crazy as hell. Like, it looks like he's just like one of those weird, crazy, you know, stalker guys who just doesn't get over the fact that it's like, you're never gonna date. And so he's just like, I can't accept that. Like, it's one of those weird situations. And so what we end up doing is we basically sort of pick up with the aftermath of all these different things. Everything starts to wind down. Of course, Superman tells Steel, we'll keep an eye on what's going on. We'll go ahead and just, you know, make sure Lana Lang is kept safe. Of course, Blank has basically obliterated the entirety of the Himalayas, and he's kind of out there in the world. But back in Hamilton County, back in Smallville, of course, it's just a regular family dinner between, you know, Superman and Lois Lane and Jonathan Kent. But in the backdrop of all this, everything's being watched by Clark Kent. Now, I want you to pay very close attention to what happens next, because I think Dan Jurgens just told us who this Clark Kent is. Clark Kent freaks out. He's like, you lied to me the whole time. Like, I thought you were Lois Lane. Like, I thought you were the pre-New 52 Lois Lane, and then everything begins to snap back. Everything begins to come into place. Clark Kent begins to regain his lost memories. And what he says is, if it's fun you want, then it's fun you'll get. With everything that we've seen in this comic so far, Lois Lane's memory being altered so she forgot when the last time it was that she met Clark Kent, the idea of him walking into a building and no one seeing him, no cameras recording him, that's reality distortion. And there's only one person I can think of in the Superman mythos that has the ability to distort reality in that capacity. That person being Mr. Mxyzptlk. I don't know if I'm right. I have no idea. I'm swinging for the fences, but I have to believe that's who this is. Because remember, Mxyzptlk loved to mess with Superman. You know, it was fun. It was all fun and games for him. It was having a good old time. He'd drive Superman up the wall, but it was always the words of fun. Even the speech bubbles indicate Mr. Mxyzptlk. So if you guys, just out of curiosity, who do you guys think this is? I want to know who you guys think this is. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, be sure to hit the subscribe button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. Also, I've seen a few of you guys ask questions with regards to why it is you'll see comments on my video a few days before they go up. Follow me on Twitter. Sometimes I'll throw videos out early on Twitter so that people who follow me there will get early access to them and they can just kind of watch them, and then I'll release a video public on YouTube a few days later or something like that. So make sure you guys follow me on Twitter, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.